Hi there. My name is Yvonne, and I'm 58 years old. I've been sitting in my kitchen for the past hour, staring at my laptop screen, reading the same email over and over again. My hands are still shaking as I type this. You know, there are some words that a mother never expects to receive from the child she raised, loved, and sacrificed for. Words that cut so deep they change everything you thought you knew about your relationship with your own daughter. I thought I had seen every possible way a family could break apart, but nothing prepared me for this moment. Before we dive into what happened, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe to join our community. Now, let me tell you about the day I discovered I no longer had a place in my daughter's life. I need to start by taking you back to when things were different, when Sarah and I were inseparable. My daughter is 28 now, but I can still picture her as that little girl with pigtails who used to follow me around the house wanting to help with everything. We had our special routine every night. After dinner, we'd curl up on the old floral couch in our living room, and I'd read her fairy tales until her eyes grew heavy. She'd always insist on one more story, and I'd give in every single time, because hearing her laugh was the highlight of my day. Saturday mornings were our baking days. Sarah would stand on a wooden stool next to me in the kitchen, flour dusting her nose as she tried to measure ingredients with her tiny hands. We'd make chocolate chip cookies, and she'd steal pieces of raw dough when she thought I wasn't looking. I always pretended not to notice, because her giggles were worth the stomachache she'd inevitably get later. During those moments, she'd look up at me with those bright blue eyes and say, "Mummy, when I grow up, I want to be just like you." Those words meant everything to me then. I was a single mother most of her childhood, working 2 jobs to keep us afloat after her father left when she was 7. David had walked out on us for a younger woman he'd met at his office, leaving me to explain to a confused little girl why Daddy wasn't coming home anymore. Sarah cried for weeks, asking when he'd return, and I held her every night, promising that we'd be okay together. But when Sarah turned 16, everything changed. David had remarried by then and was living in a beautiful house across town with his new wife and their twin boys. He'd started making more money and could offer Sarah things I simply couldn't afford. A bigger bedroom, a car for her 16th birthday, designer clothes and vacations to places I'd only seen in magazines. The transition wasn't immediate, but I watched my daughter slowly drift toward the life her father could provide. The custody arrangement had always been flexible since David had shown little interest in regular visitation during Sarah's early years. But suddenly he was playing the devoted father, showering her with gifts and opportunities. Sarah began spending more weekends at his house, and when she did come home to our small apartment, she seemed restless and dissatisfied. She'd complain that her room was too small, that our car was embarrassing, that her friends had nicer things. Each complaint felt like a small knife to my heart, because I was doing everything I could with what I had. The breaking point came during her senior year, when she decided to move in with David permanently. She claimed it would be easier for college applications, since his address was in a better school district. I knew the real reason was that she was tired of living modestly when luxury was available just across town. I helped her pack her belongings, holding back tears as I folded the clothes I'd saved up to buy her, knowing that her new stepmother would soon be taking her shopping for an entirely new wardrobe. That night, after Sarah left with her father, I sat in her empty room, surrounded by the memories of our years together. The fairy tale books were still on her shelf, and the pictures we'd taken during our baking adventures were thumbtacked to her bulletin board. I realized that the little girl who wanted to be just like me had grown into a young woman who wanted to be anything but. The years that followed were a constant struggle to maintain any meaningful connection with Sarah. When she left for college at 18, I was determined not to lose her completely. I called her every week, sent care packages filled with homemade cookies and notes, telling her how proud I was of her achievements. Her responses became increasingly brief and polite. The warmth we once shared replaced by a formal distance that broke my heart a little more each time. I remember one particular conversation during her sophomore year that still haunts me. I'd called to check in, and she sounded rushed and irritated. When I asked about her classes, she gave me one-word answers. When I mentioned that I'd love to visit her on campus sometime, she quickly changed the subject. Finally, I asked directly if everything was okay between us, and she sighed heavily before saying, "Mum, I'm just busy. Can we talk later?" But later never came unless I was the one to call again. David made sure to remind Sarah regularly about the financial support he was providing for her education, while subtly undermining me at every opportunity. Sarah would mention things he'd said during our conversations, comments about how I'd held her back, or how she was finally getting the opportunities she deserved. Each of these second-hand remarks felt like a betrayal, not just from David, but from the daughter I'd raised to be better than that kind of pettiness. Despite my limited budget, I contributed what I could to Sarah's college expenses. I took on extra shifts at the department store where I worked, setting aside money each month that I'd send to help with her books lab fees and other expenses that weren't covered by her father's contributions. I never told her about the sacrifices I was making: the dinners of crackers and soup, the delayed car repairs, the cancelled cable subscription. I wanted her to focus on her studies without worrying about my financial situation. When Sarah graduated, I was so proud that I took a day off work I couldn't afford to lose and drove 3 hours to attend the ceremony. I'd bought a new dress for the occasion, something cheerful and appropriate, that had cost more than my weekly grocery budget. But when I found Sarah after the ceremony, her greeting was lukewarm at best. She posed for a few obligatory photos with me before quickly turning her attention to her father's family, who had brought professional photographers and were planning an elaborate celebration dinner at an expensive restaurant. I wasn't invited to the dinner. Sarah mentioned it casually, assuming I'd understand that it was a family celebration organized by David and his wife. Standing there in my new dress, holding the small bouquet of flowers I'd brought for my daughter, I realized that I was no longer considered part of the family that mattered. I drove home that night with a heavy heart, understanding that my relationship with Sarah had fundamentally changed in ways I might never be able to repair. The pattern continued after graduation. Sarah moved to a city 4 hours away and started her career in marketing. Our communication became even more sporadic, limited to brief text exchanges and the occasional phone call where she'd update me on her professional achievements while sharing very little about her personal life. I continued to send birthday and Christmas gifts, but rarely received acknowledgement that they'd been received. It was as if I was slowly becoming invisible in her life, a fading presence that she tolerated out of obligation rather than love. Everything changed when Sarah met Marcus during her third year out of college. I learned about their relationship not through a personal conversation with my daughter, but through a post on social media that someone tagged me in. There was my daughter looking radiant and happy, standing next to a handsome man in what appeared to be a very expensive restaurant. The caption read, "Date night with this amazing guy," followed by heart emojis and hashtags I didn't understand. When I called Sarah the next day to ask about this new development in her life, she was surprisingly forthcoming, though still guarded. Marcus was an investment banker. She told me someone she'd met through mutual friends at a charity gala. He was ambitious, successful, and came from what she described as a good family. I could hear the pride in her voice as she talked about his achievements, his education, and the impressive circles he moved in. What struck me most was how different she sounded when talking about Marcus compared to how distant she'd become when talking to me. I expressed my happiness for her and asked if I might have the opportunity to meet Marcus sometime soon. The pause that followed my question lasted long enough for me to understand that this wasn't part of her plan. "Maybe eventually," she said vaguely, but we're taking things slow and keeping things private for now. I knew this was code for the fact that she wasn't ready to introduce Marcus to the parts of her life that didn't fit the image she was trying to project. Over the following months, I watched my daughter's relationship unfold through the carefully curated glimpses she shared on social media. There were photos from weekend trips to wine country evenings at theatre premieres and dinners at restaurants where the appetizers cost more than I typically spent on groceries for a week. Sarah looked happy and confident in these pictures, but there was something else there too. She looked like someone who was finally living the life she'd always believed she deserved. Marcus never appeared in any family gatherings, and I began to understand that Sarah was keeping her relationship with him completely separate from her history with me. When I asked direct questions about him during our infrequent phone calls, she'd give me basic information while making it clear that the details of their relationship were not something she intended to share with me. I was being systematically excluded from this important part of her life, and the message was becoming impossible to ignore. The worst part was realizing that Sarah was probably ashamed of me. My modest lifestyle, my small apartment, my working-class job. None of these things aligned with the sophisticated image she was building with Marcus. I represented the part of her past that she wanted to leave behind, the reminder of a childhood spent in circumstances she now viewed as beneath her. This realization was more painful than any of the previous slights, because it meant that my daughter was ashamed not just of our financial situation, but of me as a person. I found myself wondering if Marcus even knew I existed, or if Sarah had simply written me out of her personal narrative entirely. Perhaps she'd told him her mother had died, or maybe she'd created some other story that would explain my absence from their relationship. The thought that my own daughter might be pretending I didn't exist was almost too devastating to contemplate, but it seemed increasingly possible given her behavior. The notification that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. I was getting ready for work when my phone buzzed with a Facebook alert. Sarah had updated her relationship status to engaged, and the accompanying photo showed her hand displaying a diamond ring that must have cost more than I earned in several months. She was beaming in the picture, and Marcus was kissing her cheek while she held her hand up to catch the light on the enormous stone. My initial reaction was joy for my daughter's happiness, followed immediately by the sharp pain of realizing I'd learned about her engagement through social media rather than a personal phone call. I stared at the photo for several minutes, taking in every detail of her expression, the elegant setting where the proposal had apparently taken place, and the obvious expense of the ring. This was clearly a man who could provide Sarah with the life she'd always wanted, and I should have been purely happy for her. But underneath my happiness was a growing dread about what this engagement would mean for my already tenuous relationship with my daughter. If I'd been systematically excluded from her relationship with Marcus, what role would I have in their wedding? The question haunted me throughout the workday, and I found myself distracted and emotional as I helped customers and stocked shelves. My co-workers noticed my distress, but I couldn't find the words to explain that I'd learned about my daughter's engagement through social media like any casual acquaintance. That evening, I called Sarah to congratulate her. She answered on the fourth ring, and I could hear music and laughter in the background. "Oh, hi, Mum," she said, and I could tell she was trying to move to a quieter location. "I saw your news on Facebook," I said, trying to keep my voice bright and supportive. "Congratulations, honey. I'm so happy for you." "Thanks," she replied, but there wasn't much warmth in her voice. Marcus proposed at this beautiful restaurant overlooking the water. It was perfect. I asked about the ring, about his proposal speech, about their plans, trying to engage with her excitement and show my genuine happiness for this milestone in her life. Her answers were polite but brief, and I could sense that she was eager to get off the phone, and return to whatever celebration was happening around her. I'd love to meet Marcus soon, I said, eventually knowing this was probably my last chance to establish some connection before the wedding planning began. Maybe we could all have dinner together sometime. The pause that followed was even longer than usual, and when Sarah spoke again, her voice had cooled noticeably. "We're pretty busy with planning and everything," she said. "Maybe we'll figure something out later." That night, I lay awake thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about my place in Sarah's future. She was planning to marry a man I'd never met, in circumstances I knew nothing about, and it was becoming clear that my role in the wedding would be minimal at best. I tried to convince myself that things would improve as the planning progressed, that Sarah would eventually want her mother involved in this important milestone. But deep down, I was beginning to understand that I was hoping for something that was never going to happen. 2 weeks after the engagement announcement, I received a text message from Sarah asking for my mailing address. My heart leaped with hope and excitement, interpreting this as a sign that I was going to be included in the wedding planning process. Maybe she wanted to send me invitation samples to get my opinion. Or perhaps there were wedding magazines she wanted to share. I responded immediately with my address and added a note about how excited I was to be part of the planning process. Her response was a simple "thanks," with no elaboration about what she was sending or why she needed my address. But I allowed myself to hope anyway. For the first time in years, I felt like my daughter might be reaching out to include me in something important. I began to imagine conversations about wedding dresses, discussions about flowers and venues, and the possibility that she might even ask me to help with some aspects of the planning. I started doing research online about wedding traditions and etiquette, wanting to be prepared to offer helpful suggestions if Sarah asked for my input. I looked at mother of the bride dresses, trying to imagine what might be appropriate for the type of wedding Sarah would want. I even started setting aside money from each paycheck, hoping to contribute meaningfully to the celebration of my daughter's marriage. When the envelope arrived 3 days later, I recognized Sarah's handwriting immediately and opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a formal wedding invitation, the kind printed on expensive cardstock with elegant script lettering. Sarah Williams and Marcus Thompson were requesting the pleasure of my company at their wedding ceremony and reception. The venue was listed as the Grandview Country Club, a place I'd never heard of, but which sounded appropriately sophisticated for the kind of celebration I'd expected them to plan. As I read through the details, I felt a mixture of emotions. Relief that I was indeed invited, excitement about finally meeting Marcus and being part of Sarah's special day, but also a subtle sadness about the formality of receiving an invitation rather than a personal conversation about the wedding plans. Still, I held on to the invitation like it was a precious gift, proof that I hadn't been completely written out of my daughter's life. I immediately called Sarah to thank her for the invitation and to express my excitement about the wedding. "I got your invitation today," I said when she answered. "Everything sounds beautiful. I can't wait to be there and finally meet Marcus." Her response was polite but measured. "I'm glad you can make it," she said, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely pleased about my enthusiasm. I began making plans immediately. I researched the country club online and discovered it was even more upscale than I'd imagined, the kind of place where memberships cost more than I earned in a year. I started shopping for an appropriate dress, something elegant enough for the venue but within my limited budget. I scheduled time off work and began to allow myself to believe that this wedding might be the beginning of a new chapter in my relationship with Sarah, a chance for us to rebuild the connection we'd lost. The morning of Sarah's wedding arrived with perfect weather, and my heart full of nervous excitement. I'd spent weeks preparing for this day, choosing my outfit carefully, and practicing what I might say when I finally met Marcus. Despite all the distance between Sarah and me, I was determined to be the supportive, loving mother she deserved on her wedding day, regardless of how complicated our relationship had become. I'd chosen a navy blue dress that I felt was appropriate for the venue and the occasion, and I'd splurged on professional hair and makeup, wanting to look my best for my daughter's wedding photos. As I drove to the Grandview Country Club, I practiced conversations in my head, imagining how I might connect with Marcus, and hoping that the wedding might provide an opportunity for Sarah and me to begin healing our relationship. The country club was even more impressive in person than it had appeared in the online photos. The grounds were immaculate, with perfectly manicured gardens and a stunning view of the lake beyond. Expensive cars filled the parking lot, and I could see elegantly dressed guests making their way toward the ceremony area. Everything about the scene reinforced my understanding that this was the kind of life Sarah had always wanted, and I felt a mixture of pride and sadness, knowing that she'd achieved it. I approached the entrance to the venue with my invitation in hand, feeling both nervous and excited about the day ahead. The venue staff had set up an elegant registration table near the entrance with guest lists organized alphabetically and escorts ready to direct people to their seats. I walked up to the young woman manning the table with a smile, ready to check in and find my place in the ceremony. "Good morning," I said brightly, handing her my invitation. "I'm here for the Williams-Thompson wedding. My name is Yvonne Williams." The young woman took my invitation and began scanning through her lists with a professional smile. But as the seconds passed, her expression grew confused, and she began checking her lists more carefully. "I'm sorry," she said, after what felt like an eternity, "but I don't see your name on our guest list. Could you spell it for me again?" I repeated my name slowly, assuming there had been some clerical error, or that perhaps my name had been filed under a different variation. But as she checked and double-checked her lists, it became clear that my name simply wasn't there. "There must be some mistake," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and my smile in place. "I received an invitation. Here it is." She examined the invitation carefully, and I could see her growing more puzzled. "This is definitely our invitation," she confirmed, "but your name isn't on any of our lists. Let me get my manager." As I waited for the manager to arrive, I watched other guests checking in smoothly and making their way to the ceremony area. My hands were beginning to shake, and I was starting to understand that something was very wrong. When the manager arrived, he repeated the same process, checking multiple lists and confirming that while my invitation was legitimate, my name was nowhere to be found on their guest lists. Standing there at the registration table holding my invitation while being told my name wasn't on any list, I felt a cold certainty settling in my stomach. This wasn't a clerical error or an oversight. This was deliberate, but I needed to understand what had happened, and I needed to hear it from my daughter directly. "Could you tell me where I might find the bride?" I asked the manager, trying to maintain my composure despite the humiliation of the situation. "There seems to have been some confusion, and I'd like to speak with her directly." He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but eventually pointed me toward the bridal preparation area behind the main ceremony space. I walked across the perfectly manicured grounds, passing groups of guests, who were chatting and laughing as they found their seats for the ceremony. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged, and I felt increasingly out of place as I made my way toward the area where Sarah was getting ready. My heart was pounding, and I was trying to prepare myself for whatever conversation was about to unfold. I found Sarah in a beautiful gazebo that had been converted into a bridal preparation area, surrounded by bridesmaids I didn't recognize, and a team of stylists putting finishing touches on her hair and makeup. She looked absolutely stunning in her wedding dress, more beautiful than I'd ever seen her, and for a moment I forgot about the confusion at the registration table and simply felt overwhelmed with pride and love for my daughter. "Sarah," I called softly, not wanting to disrupt the preparations, but needing to speak with her. She looked up from her makeup mirror. and the expression that crossed her face when she saw me was not the joy or excitement I'd hoped for. Instead, she looked annoyed and slightly panicked, as if my presence was an unwelcome intrusion on her perfect day. "Mum," she said, standing up and walking away from the group of people surrounding her. "What are you doing here?" The question hit me like a physical blow, but I tried to stay calm and explain the situation. "I'm here for your wedding, honey, but there seems to be some confusion with the guest list. My name isn't on it." Sarah looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her calculating how to handle this situation. Finally, she took a deep breath and said words that I will never forget. "Did you really think you'd be invited?" Her voice was cold and matter-of-fact, as if she was asking whether I really thought it might rain. I stared at my daughter, trying to process what she'd just said. "But Sarah," I said quietly, "you sent me an invitation. I have it right here." She glanced at the invitation in my hand, with what looked like mild irritation. "That was a mistake," she said. "My wedding planner sent those out automatically based on an old contact list. I had your name removed from the actual guest list weeks ago." The cruelty of her words was breathtaking. Not only had I been deliberately excluded from my daughter's wedding, but she'd allowed me to believe I was invited to make plans and preparations, to hope that this might be a new beginning for our relationship. I looked at her beautiful face, searching for any sign of the little girl who used to tell me she wanted to be just like me. But all I could see was a stranger. "I understand perfectly," I said quietly, handing her back the invitation. "I hope you have a beautiful wedding, Sarah." And then I turned and walked away, with as much dignity as I could manage, leaving my daughter to her perfect day and her new life that had no room for the mother who had raised her. The drive home from the country club passed in a blur of tears and disbelief. I couldn't process what had just happened, couldn't reconcile the daughter I'd raised with the woman who had just told me I wasn't welcome at her own wedding. When I finally made it back to my apartment, I sat in my car for several minutes, staring at the modest building that represented everything Sarah was trying to distance herself from. Inside my apartment, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror and saw a woman dressed up for a celebration that would never include her. My carefully chosen dress, my professional hair and makeup, all of it seemed ridiculous now. I changed into comfortable clothes and sat on my couch, trying to make sense of what had happened and what it meant for any possibility of a future relationship with my daughter. The pain was unlike anything I'd experienced since my own mother's death 15 years earlier. This wasn't just rejection, it was a complete erasure of my role in Sarah's life. She hadn't just decided not to include me in her wedding. She'd actively deceived me into believing I was wanted only to humiliate me in front of strangers at her venue. The cruelty of it took my breath away. I spent the next several days in a fog of grief and confusion. I called in sick to work something I rarely did, and spent my time trying to understand how my relationship with my daughter had deteriorated so completely. I replayed every conversation we'd had in recent years, looking for signs I'd missed, or moments when I could have done something differently to prevent this outcome. My friend Linda came by on the third day after finding me unresponsive to her phone calls. When I told her what had happened at the wedding, she was furious on my behalf. "How could she do that to you?" she demanded. "You're her mother. You raised her by yourself. You sacrificed everything for that girl." Her anger was validating, but it didn't ease the pain of knowing that my own daughter felt so little regard for me. Linda stayed with me that evening, and we talked late into the night about what had happened and what it meant for my future. She helped me understand that Sarah's behavior was a reflection of her own character, not a judgment of my worth as a mother or as a person. "You gave her everything you had," Linda reminded me. "If she can't see, that if she can't value that, then that's her loss, not yours." But even with Linda's support and perspective, I struggled to accept what had happened. This wasn't just the end of my relationship with Sarah. It felt like the end of my identity as a mother. The child I'd devoted my life to raising had essentially told me that I no longer existed in her world. The finality of it was devastating. 2 weeks after the wedding, I made one last attempt to reach out to Sarah. I wrote her a long letter pouring out my heart and trying to explain how much our relationship meant to me. I acknowledged the ways I might have failed her and expressed my unconditional love and my hope that someday we might be able to rebuild what we'd lost. I mailed the letter with a desperate prayer that it might touch something in her heart and open a door to reconciliation. I never received a response. The silence was the final confirmation that my daughter had moved on with her life and had no intention of looking back. I was no longer her mother in any meaningful sense. I was simply someone who had once been important to her, a relic from a past she was eager to forget. The months following Sarah's wedding were the darkest period of my adult life. I found myself struggling to get out of bed in the morning, to find meaning in my daily routines, to imagine a future that didn't include the daughter who had been the center of my world for so many years. The grief felt overwhelming and endless, like mourning someone who had died while knowing they were very much alive and simply choosing not to include you in their life. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Martinez, who specialized in family estrangement and complicated grief. In our sessions, she helped me understand that what I was experiencing was a legitimate form of loss, even though Sarah was still alive and thriving. "You're grieving the relationship you had with your daughter and the future you imagined with her," she explained. "That's real grief, and it deserves to be honored and processed." Dr. Martinez also helped me recognize that I couldn't control Sarah's choices or force her to value our relationship. You can only control your own actions and responses. She reminded me week after week. You can choose how to move forward with your life, even if that life doesn't include the relationship with Sarah that you'd hoped for. Slowly, very slowly, I began to focus on rebuilding my own sense of identity, separate from my role as Sarah's mother. I'd spent so many years defining myself primarily through my relationship with her that I'd lost touch with who I was as an individual. I started taking a pottery class at the local community centre, something I'd always wanted to try, but never had time for when I was working multiple jobs and trying to support Sarah's dreams. The pottery class led me to discover a talent I never knew I had. Working with clay felt therapeutic and meditative, and I found myself looking forward to the weekly sessions. The other students in the class became a new social circle for me. People who knew nothing about my complicated family history and who valued me for who I was in the present moment. Through pottery, I met Margaret, a woman about my age who was dealing with her own family challenges. Her adult son had struggled with addiction for years, and she'd had to learn how to love him while protecting herself from the chaos of his choices. Margaret became a close friend and a source of wisdom about how to navigate difficult family relationships. "Love doesn't always look like staying," Margaret told me one evening as we worked on our projects together. "Sometimes love means letting go and taking care of yourself." Her words resonated deeply with me and helped me begin to accept that loving Sarah didn't require me to keep hoping for a relationship she clearly didn't want. I also started volunteering at a local literacy program teaching adults how to read. The work was deeply meaningful and reminded me of the skills and experience I'd gained during my years as a mother and as someone who'd worked multiple jobs to support my family. I discovered that I was good at connecting with people who'd had challenging life experiences, and the students I worked with often told me how much my patience and encouragement meant to them. 6 months after the wedding, I received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Martinez. She asked if I'd be interested in participating in a support group she was starting for parents dealing with estrangement from their adult children. I think you might have something valuable to offer other parents who are going through similar experiences, she said. The idea of helping others navigate this type of loss felt like it might give new meaning to my own painful experience. The support group became an important part of my healing process. Hearing other parents share their stories helped me understand that family estrangement was more common than I'd realized, and that it wasn't necessarily a reflection of failed parenting. Some of the most loving, dedicated parents in the group were dealing with children who had simply chosen different paths that didn't include maintaining close family relationships. In the group, I learned to talk about Sarah without the desperate hope that had characterized my approach for so long. Instead of focusing on what I'd lost, I began to talk about what I'd gained from my experience as her mother, and how those experiences had shaped me into the person I was becoming. I could love the memory of raising her while accepting that our adult relationship might never be what I'd hoped. A year after the wedding, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I wrote Sarah one final letter, not asking for reconciliation or trying to change her mind, but simply expressing my unconditional love and my wishes for her happiness. I told her that I would always be available if she ever wanted to reconnect, but that I was moving forward with my own life and wouldn't continue reaching out to her. I will always love you and be proud of the strong, independent woman you've become. I wrote, I hope your marriage brings you joy and fulfillment, and I hope you build the life you've always dreamed of. If you ever want to talk, you know how to reach me. But I understand if that day never comes, and I want you to know that's okay too. After I mailed that letter, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since before the wedding. I'd said everything I needed to say, and I'd released myself from the exhausting cycle of hope and disappointment that had defined the previous year. I was finally free to build a life that wasn't centered around waiting for my daughter to decide she wanted me in it. Now, 2 years later, I can honestly say that I'm happier than I've been in years. My life is full of meaningful relationships, creative pursuits, and work that feels important. I still love Sarah, and I probably always will, but I've learned that love doesn't require the other person's participation. I can love her from a distance, while building a rich, fulfilling life for myself. I've learned that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the space to make their own choices, even when those choices hurt us. I've also learned that my worth as a person, and even as a mother, isn't determined by whether my daughter chooses to have a relationship with me. I gave her the best upbringing I could with the resources I had, and the rest is up to her. The most important lesson I've learned is that it's possible to find peace and happiness, even when your life doesn't turn out the way you expected it to. Sometimes the door that closes leads to opportunities and relationships you never would have discovered otherwise. I'm grateful for the years I had with Sarah, and I'm also grateful for the person I've become since I stopped waiting for her to validate my existence. If you're dealing with a similar situation in your own family, know that you're not alone and that it is possible to find peace on the other side of this kind of loss. What experiences have shaped your understanding of family relationships? Have you ever had to learn to love someone from a distance? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Please like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe to join our community of people who believe in the power of resilience and self-love. Share this story with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone in their family struggles. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is let go and trust that everyone will find their own way to happiness, even if those paths don't intersect the way we once hoped they would.